evening. My name is Jason Wallace. I'm the pastor of Christ Presbyterian Church here in the Salt Lake Valley. We welcome you to another installment of the Ancient Paths. Our church is a congregation of the Orthodox Presbyterian Church. We are an evangelical congregation. We are conservative in our theology. If you're looking for a church that takes God and His Word seriously, that emphasizes simple, reverent worship, expository preaching, family worship, things like this, we encourage you to worship with us. We meet at 8630 West, 2700 South, Sunday mornings at 11 a.m. and Sunday evenings at 5:30 p.m. We have a simple meal that follows the evening service every Sunday except the first Sunday, which is we have communion, and we have a covered dish or potluck that follows the morning service. We also have a mission work in Logan that meets Sunday nights at 6:30 p.m. at 1315 East, 700 North in the Faith and Fellowship Center. For more information, you can go to our website. On November 7th, I had a debate with Martin Tanner from KSL's Religion Today, and the subject of our debate was whether the LDS scriptures accord with the Bible. I tried to cover that in the debate, but the main argument from Mr. Tanner, you can actually see this debate on YouTube. The main argument he made was not specifically on that, but he said that the real issue was whether the Book of Mormon was true, and he believed that it was impossible for Joseph Smith to have written the Book of Mormon, that it had to be divine revelation. I'm not much of a student of LDS history. I've read a number of things, but wanted to take the opportunity after we had finished with some of the things we've been covering before to come back to that question of who wrote the Book of Mormon. Was it possible for Joseph Smith to write that book? And so we've been very privileged this evening to have with us Ms. Sandra Tanner from Utah Lighthouse Ministries. Sandra, always a great privilege to have you with us. I'm not sure why you keep giving us that privilege, but we appreciate it very much. And you know, it's somewhat providential that you actually have been covering that in one of your recent newsletters.
Right, right.
So the argument that was made in the debate was that Joseph Smith talked about finding metal plates and stone boxes and houses of cement and things like this, and it was just utterly impossible for him to have foreseen these things. Who do you believe wrote the Book of Mormon?
Well, I firmly believe that Joseph Smith wrote it. The Book of Mormon is obviously a product of his time. If you want to make it someone like Spalding, or if you want to make it a conspiracy with him and Cowdery or Rigdon, or whatever way you want to frame it, it obviously was done in that time frame, in the 1820s. And I personally believe that Joseph Smith is the author of it. I see in the beginning of the story a parallel to Joseph Smith's life, where you have Nephi, the younger brother, who's favored by the father, and he's the one that's going to lead the family to safety, and he's chosen by God. And this is a direct mirroring of Joseph in Genesis. So I see Joseph Smith, who is a younger brother, who sees himself as the one chosen of God to lead the family forward, putting his own biography into the Book of Mormon story. So Nephi becomes his alter ego, and also paralleling this with Joseph in Genesis, which is one of the reasons I think Joseph wrote the Book of Mormon and not Spalding or Cowdery or Rigdon or someone else, because I don't think any of those other men would have cast the story with Nephi the way it's written, because it so mirrors Joseph Smith's own image of himself.
But now Joseph Smith presents this history where he says that two groups of people come to America. The second is from Israel, and they're divided into two groups. This is something that would have been completely unbelievable in the 19th century, right?
Well, that's what the Mormons want to tell us. One of the things Mormons will often say to me is, how could Joseph Smith have known all these things? And out comes the list of all the things they think he couldn't have known about. But as this particular book, Indian Origins and the Book of Mormon by Dan Vogel points out, there were over 200 books written before the Book of Mormon detailing what they felt was the history of the American Indian. And they tell how in these different books, They speculate that the American Indian were part of the lost tribes of Israel. They speculate that there had been an advanced civilization of white people in the Americas that were killed off by the savage people, leaving the dark-skinned ones that the Pilgrims found. That there had been a migration at the time of the Tower of Babel. And so you have these mirrors in the folklore and assumptions of the Indians of Joseph Smith's day mirrored in the Book of Mormon. In these 200 books and magazines before the Book of Mormon, you have them speaking of brass and copper plates with writing on them being found in the Indian burial mounds, which I think gave Joseph Smith his idea. There was also legends that the Indians had a lost book of God. There were stories about the great wars that they had, that they fought with swords, that they had steel swords and steel bows, that they had mammoths, which I think is why we have elephants in the early part of the Book of Mormon. So all of these different elements that many times a Mormon will bring up to me as, oh, well, how would Joseph know to put this, that, or the other in the book? And I said, well, because it was the common knowledge of the day, although that knowledge has since been refuted. No one today, other than the Mormons, really would hold to the Indians being of Israelite origin, or that the Indians had Christianity and Judaism here. All of those things were in these 200 books. They all talked about them being familiar with Egyptian hieroglyphics, comparing the Mayan hieroglyphics with the Egyptian hieroglyphics. In Joseph Smith's day, they knew about the ruins in Mexico. So there was plenty of information around for an imaginative young man to come up with the story. Now, the Mormon will say, well, how could this young untrained boy write this book? And just because someone else did something I couldn't do doesn't mean the other person couldn't do it. I can't write music like Mozart, but that doesn't mean Mozart couldn't do it. And because Joseph Smith I see as a very creative person throughout his life, I feel he obviously is the author. His creativity extends beyond the Book of Mormon, that he can walk across a hill in Missouri and see a pile of stones from someone's foundation of their cabin or something. Someone asked him about these rocks, and he says, oh, that's Adam's altar. The Garden of Eden was just down the road, and this is where Adam built his altar. I mean, he changes the whole history of the world, the whole history of the Bible, and has everything starting here in America. I mean, that's creativity. Then you have him going on, he gets this Book of Abraham, and suddenly, oh, wow, these papyri aren't just papyri from the Egyptian religion. No, this is the signature of Abraham right here. So you see that creative force throughout his life that I don't have a problem seeing him able to write the Book of Mormon.
Joseph Smith only had, what, a third grade, or 3 years of formal schooling?
Yes, but that doesn't mean he wasn't knowledgeable. We know that when he was 20, he was enrolled in school at that time. He had a thirst for learning. His father had been a school teacher at one point, so there was education in the home. Joseph's grandfather had written and published a book. So there was a sense of knowledge in this home. His father subscribed to the local newspaper. It's not like that they were just country bumpkins out here like some hillbillies or something that didn't know anything, about English. There were resources. There were libraries in Palmyra and Manchester. There were newspapers. There was material around him to pick up this culture of what everyone was saying about the Indian.
Some of these books actually were in that library there that he had access to, was a subscriber to that library, right?
No, well, I'm not sure what he was a subscriber to, but there were libraries in both Palmyra and Manchester where he could have seen many of the books involved.
There was I forget the summary, but there was a condensed version of View of the Hebrews and another work that was actually in one of those libraries. Probably
Adair's book.
Yeah, Joseph Adair.
Yeah, View of the Hebrews was a book written in 1823 by a minister named Ethan Smith, not related to Joseph. And he was pastor in Pulteney, Vermont, where the Cowdery family went. But Ethan Smith's book, View of the Hebrews, raises many of the theories and ideas that are put in the Book of Mormon, so that you can see an influence there, whether Joseph read View of the Hebrews or just picked up all the discussions that were going on in the community because of his book. There is obviously parallel thoughts between the books as to the origin of the Indian, their religion, culture, and all of their advancements and things.
There was a series of questions that was put together by Hugh Nibley years ago, saying that if you wanted to do the equivalent of what Smith would have had to have done, you'd have to write a book about ancient Tibet, during this time period and all like this. But this was actually not something far off, but something that was centered not just on what they were hearing out of Central America, but what was happening right there as well, because they had these Indian mounds right there, all around them.
Right down the road in New York there, around Joseph Smith, were different mounds from the Indians, so that there was a natural curiosity amongst people about who built these mounds, why were they there, if they had all these bones in them, does that represent some huge war, and who did they war with? What all does this represent? So Joseph Smith had a ready-made market for his book, in that it answered all the kinds of questions people had about the Indians of the day, the things they were speculating about. And suddenly, here's the book. There were, in these 200 books and magazines before the Book of Mormon, there was talk about them having, at one time the Indians supposedly had a book about God that had been lost. Well, that sets up the stage for Joseph to come up with his book and fulfill that need, to say, aha, hey guys, I found that book, here it is.
In the Manchester newspaper, there are actually reports that predated Smith claiming to find his plates, of others saying they had found metal plates in these Indian burial mounds.
Right, and in this book, Indian Origins in the Book of Mormon, he tells of the different books that mention the plates in the mound builders. And for the viewers that want to pursue this further, if they go to just Google and type in Indian Origins and the Book of Mormon, they'll pull up a website where you can actually read the whole book online. I mean, free. They can just go read this, and it's a tremendous resource showing what were the assumptions of Joseph's day about the Indian, and you can see how they parallel what was in print at the time, parallels the ideas in the Book of Mormon. Joseph Smith wasn't coming out with something out of the blue, totally opposite to what everybody thought. He brought out a book that mirrored what everybody thought and reinforced what they already assumed about the Indian.
Well, let's shift ground a little bit. We've been talking about sort of his context, and that this was not something outside of the bounds of what he would have been able to do. The LDS Church used to identify specific sites in South America, or in Central America, I should say, with Book of Mormon sites, didn't they?
Yes, well, they used to claim that when Lehi sailed over here, he landed in Chile, and then they had their assumptions of the narrow neck of land, and then that the Indians then migrated up to New York to the Hill Cumorah. But as time has gone by, the Mormons have continually shrunk the Book of Mormon lands because they realized, well, number one, the story doesn't make sense over that large a landmass. You can't have these armies trooping back and forth from South America to New York for battles. I mean, where's the supply line? How do you get food to eat? Of course, I guess they feel the land was filled with people. They could have plundered as they went, but there's no evidence that it was filled with people that they could have plundered as they went. And then you had the problem of the languages of the Indians. The Indians in the Americas have very different languages. It's not like they all spoke the same language, which the Book of Mormon sort of implies that they all did. But in fact, I mean, if you're a missionary with Wycliffe, you go down to Central America, you got to learn a bunch of different languages. Each little town or village you're going to work in has got a different language. So that as the Mormon scholars started trying to put the Book of Mormon arguments together, they realized we've got to narrow down the land mass so that we can have manageable travel distances, one community, more likely one language, all those things. So they settled on the Mayans because it's the one place where you have great buildings, and they want to tie into those artifacts. Oh, the Book of Mormon says they built great buildings, so let's look at the Mayan. So they've really centered in on that. But the Mormons today will not commit themselves to a Book of Mormon location, which I think is curious. They have no map. And in this manual, which is Book of Mormon Student Manual, Religion 121 and 122, which is in print today. I was at the Mormon Distribution Center 2 days ago, and they had it there for sale. And it's got this page. I don't know if this can...
Yeah, if you flip it around, I think we can zoom in on that a little bit.
Okay.
Just hold it still.
That is supposedly a map of...
it's this camera right here. There we go.
Of the Book of Mormon lands. And, but it's not set to North or South America or Central America or anything. It's just this odd shaped thing with the different names of the different cities in it. And so let me read you what it says at the bottom of the page. Possible comparative relationships for use of the sites mentioned in the Book of Mormon based on internal evidences. No effort should be made to identify points on this map with any existing geographical locations. Well, why wouldn't you try to put it to a geographical location? If it's actual history, why wouldn't you try to figure out where the story happened? I mean, Bible scholars try to figure out where the story happened, and we have maps in our Bibles because they figured out some of them. It's pretty obvious. I mean, you start with Jerusalem and fan out, and you can start finding all kind of places. But you can't with the Book of Mormon.
The argument I heard in the debate, which I've heard numerous times, is how could Joseph have known all these things? You know, on a superficial level, in Central America, you have the Mayans building something very similar in construction to a pyramid. You have hieroglyphic writing. Aren't there plenty of parallels that seem to indicate that there was something divinely inspired in this, or do you think that the parallels break down?
Well, the scholars don't see any connection to Egypt, but there is no evidence to say that Joseph couldn't have known of these things. The fact that they had knowledge of these very same ruins in Joseph Smith's day is sufficient for him to have the ideas that come up in the Book of Mormon. Nothing is so specific in the Book of Mormon that you can say, aha, that is so specific, you couldn't know about that any other way. These great buildings are detailed in these different books. They were known about. The Mexican ruins were known about. Obviously, we know about more than they did then, but they knew of enough of them that the knowledge was there for him to say there were these great buildings.
Book of Mormon goes through a great amount of detail in terms of units of measure, money, things like this. Have they ever found any money that corresponds to the Book of Mormon details?
No. Now, see, in the Book of Mormon, it doesn't actually use the word coin, but in the heading of the chapter that talks about their money measurements, it uses the word coin. But okay, we'll give them the benefit of the doubt. It wasn't a coin, it was a measurement. Even so, it's a measurement that's based on a gold and silver concept where gold has more value than silver. I think I don't remember if it's 2 to 1 or what, but there is these measurement equivalents that are broken down and given in their currency. The problem is the Indians never had gold and silver as a monetary system. They used cocoa beans, they used jade, maize, or whatever. You know, it was things like this that they traded in, not silver and gold. And so the whole Book of Mormon system would be foreign to the Indians and to the Mayans. They just wouldn't have had a concept of using metal as a medium of paying for things.
One of the things that was said in the debate was that they had clubs into which they had taken these wooden clubs and put stone into them that was very sharp and it could cut someone's head off. But that's not what the Book of Mormon describes, is it? It actually describes steel.
It talks of steel swords. These were people that supposedly came from Jerusalem at 600 BC. So these guys know what a sword is. And so when they say they make swords and they make bows and arrows and that, they're bringing this knowledge from the old world. So we expect them that when they say in the new world that they're making these things, that they're making the same kind of instrument that they would have had in the old world. You would hardly call the Indian machete thing, whatever, I forget the Indian name for it, but you wouldn't call it a sword. I mean, well, I suppose if you were fighting for a word, an equivalent, you could say it was sword-like or something, but it wasn't. It's like a paddle. If you take a big rectangular paddle and put obsidian points all around the edge, then it's kind of like razor hacking or something, and you can slit the guy's throat with it. It would be effective as a weapon, but you wouldn't call it a sword. And the Book of Mormon talks about a sword being in a sheath. The whole concept in the Book of Mormon would be of a sword in terms of what we're used to thinking of sword, not in terms of this kind of machete thing that the Indians were using.
If you'd like to join in the conversation, you can call us here at 973-8820, 973-TV20. We have with us Sandra Tanner, the director of the Utah Lighthouse Ministry. So, has there been any evidence in archaeology to validate anything that wouldn't have been fairly easily known to Joseph Smith? I mean, have there been?
I am not aware of anything. Now, the Mormons will bring up chiastic structure in the Book of Mormon as a poetic form that he couldn't have known about, but it was known in his day. It was called parallelism. Like when Jesus says, the first shall be last and the last shall be first, that's a form of parallelism. So, yeah, there are some parallelisms in the Book of Mormon, but then when you find out that there's a thesis at BYU on parallelisms or chiastic structure in the Doctrine and Covenants, that destroys the whole argument that it proves the Book of Mormon has to be an ancient Hebrew source because he has a poetic form like this. It just means Joseph had this poetic form in his writing ability, and that's why it shows up in the D&C. I mean, no one's claiming the D&C is a foreign language or ancient Hebrew or anything else. So if it's in there, it shows he just had that form of writing.
Now, some people may not be aware that chiasmus is basically a certain format. You know, like
right.
The simple form is sort of the A, B, B, A.
Yeah.
The first shall be last, the last shall be first. It can get a little more detailed than that. You see that in the Bible over
right.
and over, especially in the story of the flood. Very, very detailed. The thing that strikes me is that someone who has read the Bible, though scholars may not have put a name to it, someone who's read the Bible and is trying to speak in a form like the Bible is going to imitate the forms of the Bible.
Right. Well, I think you have the same thing that you could argue with Mozart. I don't think he was schooled in all the forms of music and would have known the names for everything when he did his different symphonies and compositions as a young child. But he understood the concept of music and could write the music out. So because someone has picked up the feel for it, they don't have to necessarily know the name.
We have a caller. We have Neil with us from Salt Lake City. Good to have you with us this evening.
Yes, my question is, what's the name of your organization and what is the purpose for the discussion tonight and why target the LDS Church for it?
Okay. Thank you. Our organization is Christ Presbyterian Church. We're a congregation of the Orthodox Presbyterian denomination. The Pearl of Great Price in Joseph Smith's History, Chapter 1, Joseph Smith says, I have learned for myself that Presbyterianism is not true. We're not targeting Mormons. If you go back and look at some of our previous episodes, I think you'll see that we've had discussions with people such as Martin Tanner, Alma Allred, and others. And we have tried to discuss these things in a respectful manner. But what is clear is that Mormonism is founded on a denial of the validity of other churches. Joseph Smith was told, supposedly in his first vision, that he is not to join any of the existing churches because all their professors are corrupt, all their creeds are an abomination. And it's clear that we are singled out among that. There are others that are mentioned, such as the Baptist and Methodist, but we get singled out to be said in that part of the Pearl of Great Price that Presbyterianism is not true. Now, I am a Presbyterian by conviction. I wasn't born Presbyterian, but I came to those conclusions. I believe that what is carried under the term Presbyterianism is biblical Christianity. Now, what do I do when someone says that's not true? I respond to it. I try to respond to that in love, try to respond to it not in vitriol, but with substance. And we've done that. And, you know, to put it in the vernacular, we don't go off in a corner and whine and cry that Mormons are picking on us when they say that Presbyterianism is not true. When we respond and say, no, Mormonism is not true, we hope they don't go off in a corner and whine and cry that we're picking on them. We're each making truth claims. Now, we invite people to join in the conversation, and I think we can engage one another respectfully and have more light than heat, which is, I think, a rarity all too often. And our guest is the director of Utah Lighthouse Ministries, which is an evangelical ministry, not directly connected with any specific church or congregation. And anyway, appreciate your call. And we have with us Kim from Spanish Fork. Kim, good to have you with us this evening.
Hi, thank you for taking my call. I am not LDS. I used to be, but as soon as I started investigating, I saw the falsehood of it. Anyway, I have a question. Joseph Smith, I had heard, but I'm not sure. I have a question for Sandra. Did Joseph Smith ever admit when he was in Carthage jail that polygamy was wrong? And if so, where can we find that resource?
Thank you for calling.
There is a claim in the reorganized LDS Church that he repented of polygamy at the end. That, I think, is well, who knows? Clearly, he engaged in polygamy. He didn't take wives in the last, I think it's 6 months of his life. How much of that would have been from fear of exposure or being arrested, we don't know. Was he afraid of Emma finding out? Were things just too hectic? I don't know. But because of that lull, there are those that maintain that he repented of it, and someone made a claim that he was sorry that the thing had ever come up and that it was about to ruin the church or something. As to a source for that, you'd have to email me at utlm.org, just Sandra at utlm.org, and ask me the question, and I can send you a reference for it. But right off the top of my head, I couldn't tell you what the reference is.
We have people lining up. We have John from West Valley. Good to have you with us this evening.
Yes, I listened to your program, and I want to compliment you. You have a very thoughtful program. I am LDS.
Thank you.
And I do believe in the Book of Mormon, and I think one of the strongest, there's a lot of, actually, the witnesses, especially the three witnesses, even though they had a falling out with Joseph Smith, to the end of their life, they all maintained their testimony of the truth of the Book of Mormon. I'd like to have your guest comment about that.
Okay, thank you very much. And it's nice. I actually do get fan mail from active LDS because we do try to deal with people respectfully and appreciate that that's being recognized. But what's your response?
Okay.
The witnesses.
David Whitmer, well, all three of the witnesses, David Whitmer, Oliver Cowdery, and Martin Harris, all left Mormonism in the late 1830s over different issues. They had problems with Joseph Smith's handling of money, the changing of the revelations, and so there were a lot of factors that came up in their leaving. Whitmer never came back into the Mormon Church, and he wrote a pamphlet in 1887, I think it was, called An Address to All Believers in Christ. In this book, Whitmer maintained his belief in the Book of Mormon, but he also maintained that Joseph Smith was a fallen prophet. And in fact, he said, if you believe my testimony about the Book of Mormon, you have to also believe that God spoke to me and told me to separate myself from the Latter-day Saints. Now, that's a paraphrase, but that's pretty close to what he said. We sell a copy of his little pamphlet. I think every Mormon ought to read it, because you should know all of his testimony, not just that he still affirmed the Book of Mormon, because there were other things he affirmed, that Joseph Smith was a fallen prophet, that he had changed the revelations, he had gone into sin with polygamy, he had brought in priesthood into the church that wasn't there at the beginning. So there's a lot more to David Whitmer's story than saying, well, at the end he affirmed the Book of Mormon. If we're to weigh out these men's testimonies, we have to weigh out the rest of the things they affirmed or didn't affirm to evaluate how reliable they are. Martin Harris left Mormonism and went into a splinter group, went as a missionary for James Strang to England. At one time, he was a supporter of the Shaker movement. Oliver Cowdery at one point left the Mormon church and joined the Methodists, became their church secretary, and those minutes and things are still in existence today. He did try to go back into Mormonism as the Mormons were coming west, and at Council Bluffs he got rebaptized, but that didn't last very long, like a couple of weeks. And then he goes back to his brother-in-law, David Whitmer, in Richmond, Missouri, and dies at Whitmer's home. And Whitmer said that Cowdery died believing and affirming, as he did, that Joseph Smith was a fallen prophet. So it's a much more complicated story than just saying, well, these three died with their testimony. Their lives were very complicated, and I don't think it's that convincing when you see their whole life structure that they affirmed this at the end. There's so many things that they got involved in that raise questions to me as to their credibility, their honesty, their reliability. Joseph Smith charged them with all sorts of crimes when they were excommunicated. So how do we know who these men really were?
Didn't Martin Harris actually say that he saw as much support for the Shaker revelations as for the Book of Mormon?
Yes, he did. And so that raises the question, then how valid is the testimony for the Book of Mormon if he had as great a one for Shakerism?
We have with us Douglas from Mapleton. Good to have you with us this evening.
Hi, yes. What I was calling about is I don't think people realize the way the witnesses witnessed the Book of Mormon. They didn't witness it as reading it with actual words, but as a mind's eye, a spiritual type reading, if I might say. Am I out of the ballpark, or is that, because that's how I understand that they understood that they witnessed it as a spiritual thing, not as a actual word-on-word type thing.
Thank you for calling.
Do you want me to comment on that?
Yeah.
Okay. When you read the testimony of the three witnesses at the front of the Book of Mormon, you would assume that the three of them were together and looked at the plates like a book's on my table, and they're looking at it, and they've got a testimony, this is the real stuff. But in fact, it didn't happen that way. The three of them with Joseph Smith go out into the woods to pray for an angelic visitation to show them that the Book of Mormon's true, because they can't know whether his translation's true. He always has the plates hidden or in the woods or in a box or something. They wouldn't have known the language if they'd have seen anything. They wouldn't have known if it was true or not. So they go out in the woods to pray. Well, as they're praying, nothing happens. And so Martin Harris says, well, I must be the problem here. It's my lack of faith. I'm going to drop out, guys, because I must be holding things back. So when Martin Harris leaves the group, then the two witnesses pray, and they claim that the heavens opened and they saw the angel, and it affirmed that the Book of Mormon was true, and they were shown the plates. But you have to remember, this is a vision. This is not sitting in the front room looking at the plates and looking at his translation. They're out in the woods in a vision experience. Then Joseph goes off to find Martin Harris. He prays then with Martin Harris. And we have Joseph's account of what happened, not Martin's account. Joseph says, as we prayed, the same vision was opened to our eyes that the other two had got. He says, well, at least it was for me. And so again, it's a vision experience. Now, Martin just says, "'Tis enough mine eyes have beheld." Well, we don't know what he beheld or what happened, but it's a vision. It's just a mind-induced experience. It's not a literal witness like you would have in a courtroom where someone could say, hey, I thumbed the pages of those metal plates and I looked at his translation over here and I can assert that these things are true. It wasn't that kind of a testimony. It was a vision experience that they felt this angel told them it was true.
We know, was it Cowdery that said that Joseph Smith didn't translate in the way that many people would expect, with the plates open on one hand and writing things out, but rather he was using a seer stone in his hat.
David Whitmer.
Oh, Whitmer.
Yeah.
But one of the witnesses basically says that he wasn't actually reading the plates. He was holding his face into a hat, and the words would appear on the stone in the hat.
Martin
as he
Harris
had it
talks
pulled
about
up over
it too. Yes, the people that were on the scene, Joseph Smith's wife, his brother-in-law, Martin Harris, and David Whitmer, all of these people that were on the scene tell of him having a stone in a hat. Now, this stone he's using is the stone he found back in 1822 or 23 when he's digging a well for Willard Chase. He sees this unusual kind of stone, decides to hang on to it. Willard Chase claimed that he owned it, but anyways, Joseph borrowed it from him. But he has this unusual shape and colored stone that he's got in a hat. Now, before the Book of Mormon came along, he was using this stone in a hat to find buried treasure. You could pay him, I don't know what he charged, 25 cents, $1, I don't know, to walk over your property, and he would put his face in his hat and look at this stone. It was like crystal ball gazing, and he could tell you where buried treasure was. Well, when he gets to doing the Book of Mormon, he only does the first part of the Book of Mormon with the Urim and Thummim that are saved with the plates, and then he loses the 116 pages. God takes the plates away, and he doesn't have the Urim and Thummim anymore. From that point on, he uses the stone in a hat. And this is what the witnesses, the people around him, all describe it this way, that he put the same stone that he used for money digging in the hat, and the plates wouldn't have to be in the room. They could be on the table covered up, or they could be hid under the hearth or out in the woods in a tree trunk. I mean, they all describe this. And then he would look at this stone in his hat, and Whitmer talks about the spiritual light that would shine, and so it's kind of like reading a ticker tape. If anyone knows what those are anymore. A computer monitor, like texting on your cell phone, you'd get these little messages across there of the wording for the Book of Mormon. And the witnesses said that if he didn't get it right, he didn't get the next sentence. So it makes everything in the translation come through truly the power of God, not through his imagination or thinking or thought process or his wording. Everything becomes literally the words of God, which raises questions for the bad grammar in the Book of Mormon, because the Mormons want to say, well, the bad grammar is because he put it in his own verbiage, and so of course it would be bad grammar. But the witnesses said he read it off the plates. The English translation was given to him word for word, and they all describe it that way. The average Mormon thinks of him with the plates out there, and he's looking at the plates, and he's trying to figure out how to write it down, and he's dictating it to Cowdery, but it isn't that kind of a process at all. Cowdery's on the other side, maybe a blanket between them, and Joseph's got a head in a hat dictating this story to him. So it's a very magical process. It doesn't sound like when Bible scholars, when they look at Bible translations, they're looking at the Hebrew or Greek text to make their translation. They aren't just doing a magic thing.
We have another caller. We have Dan from Salt Lake City. Good to have you with us this evening.
Thank you. I have a three-part question. Mr. House, Sister or Mrs. Tanner would explain Paul's, number one, would be Paul's statement that in the last days there would be a restoration of all things. Secondly, why those that leave the church, Joseph Smith said, could not leave the church alone, as she has spent a career agonizing over the church. And secondly, when I see the active LDS women, they're so peaceful and radiant, and Mrs. Tanner always looks so unhappy and contentious. If she could just help me understand.
If she is, I must not be running in the same circles if she's unhappy and contentious. Thank you for calling. You have a Scottish background, which some people think makes us
It's in the blood.
Other people think that makes us all contentious, but
right. Well, I believe that what Mormonism stands for is not pictured in the Bible. The restoration should be a restoration to New Testament Christianity. If you're going to restore anything, it's got to be... Restoration implies you're going back to the original. I don't see Mormonism going back to the original. They are not based on the New Testament. They are based on Joseph Smith's revelations that go beyond the New Testament. So that whole argument, to me, doesn't work. When you bring out that they aren't following the patterns they claim to, for instance, they say, the original church had 12 apostles, you got to have 12 apostles. And then you point out, well, you have 15 because you've got 3 in the first presidency that are apostles besides the 12. So that who were the first presidency in Joseph Smith in Jesus Christ's day? And they will say, well, that was Peter, James, and John. Well, they were part of the 12. They weren't separate from the 12. So you aren't following the pattern. If you're going to make this literal, that you got to follow the pattern, you have too many apostles. And then the Mormon will say to me, well, we believe in modern day revelation. Well, then it's not a restoration. You're adding all the way along. You point out there's no temple marriage in the New Testament. There's no temple marriage in the Book of Mormon. Oh, well, God gave this revelation to Joseph Smith. Then it's not a restoration. Restoration implies you're going back to just what you had. If you restore a 57 Chevy, you don't put on modern day big wheel tires on it and jack up the chassis and all this stuff. You don't put in a brand new CD system in the car or something. It's not restored. If you're going to have a restoration, it's got to go back to the original, and I don't see the Mormons doing that. They are adding doctrine on. And as far as our ministry and our years of research on Mormonism, this comes down to a matter of perspective on Christianity. From my perspective, I truly worry that the Mormons are not engaging in a Christian religion, that the Mormon doctrine is counter to Christianity. Now, I'm not making a judgment on all the Mormons. That's between them and God where their heart is. But the Mormon religion, I do not believe is Christian. It makes me concerned for the Mormons' eternal welfare. I feel an obligation to go back to my family. I mean, my roots go back to Brigham Young, to the very beginning of this thing. So did my husband, Gerald. His family goes back to Kirtland days. This is our family. We have a concern to warn our family and friends they are following a false gospel. If Mormonism is not true, then it is a very serious thing to be in a false religion. So from the Mormons' perspective, they say, well, of course we're true. And so then I'm fighting against the truth. But what if it isn't true? If it is not what it claims to be, then I see it as being what Jesus warned about, that in the last days there would be false prophets. And that's where I feel Mormonism comes into the picture. They are the false prophets predicted in the New Testament.
One of the things that just baffles me, because I keep hearing this all the time, if someone leaves a Baptist church, as an example, and joins the Mormon church, and they go and share with them their critiques and of the Baptist church with their family, and try to show them Mormonism as a contrast to that, they view that as wonderful. They view that as sharing and everything else. But if someone leaves the Mormon church and then tries to share their criticisms, then that's attacking. And that's
right.
Contentions of the devil, contentions of the devil.
Right.
And it's just
well, it comes... To me, it goes back to what you were mentioning earlier about Joseph Smith's own story. When the whole basis of their religion is based on Joseph Smith's account in the back of the Pearl of Great Price, where he specifically says Methodists, Baptists, and Presbyterians are wrong, then of course the Baptists, Methodists, and Presbyterians are going to say, well, wait a minute, I think there's another side to this story, and are going to respond back. Mormons send out 50,000 whatever missionaries all over the world to preach their gospel, when part of their gospel is that these other churches do not rightly represent God, do not have God's authority. Then of course the other churches are going to respond with, well, let's look at your claims. How do we know you're what you say you are? So I don't understand this thing where the Mormons don't want me to look at it, but they can make all kind of accusations against my faith.
Yeah, I mean, not everyone does this, of course, but I'm not ascribing motives to the previous caller, but I get so frustrated when people say that they can say that Presbyterian is not true. They can call our professors corrupt, our creed's an abomination. They can say that we're part of that great abominable whore and this and that and the other. They can do all these things and throw all these rocks, and the moment you respond, contentions of the devil, contentions of the devil. I mean, it's just like, it's maddening. I mean, it's such a double standard. We have with us Matthew from Salt Lake. Matthew, good to have you with us.
Hi. I want to try to be respectful, but I have to comment on Dan and his wisdom that he is so happy to share. Dan, Joseph Smith was one of the most successful charlatans and frauds the United States has ever seen. And the reason why a lot of us that were raised Mormon, that have had the scales fall off of our eyes and won't be silent anymore, is because we realize that, like everyone, we're all sinners. Mormons have, the vast majority of Mormons, Dan obviously is included, are so self-righteous and convinced that they have a monopoly on Christ's love and God's love for all of us. That is why he feels that we stir up trouble. Well, I just want him to realize that he, like the rest of us, is a sinner, and he needs to look in the mirror before he starts casting up aspersions on people like Sandra or anyone else.
Hey, thank you for calling.
Have a good day.
You too. What is it, Luke 18? The publican and the Pharisee go to the temple to pray. Pharisee says, God, thank you for making me a righteous man. I'm not like other men, not like this publican. I tithe of all I possess. I fast twice a week. And the publican beats on his breast, dares not raise his eyes to heaven, and says, God, be merciful to me, a sinner. For what it's worth, and I'm sure can speak for you in this as well. I don't view Mormons as special sinners.
No.
But we're all sinners.
That's right.
And we all need to be forgiven in Christ, and we need to come to the real Christ, not a counterfeit.
Right.
When we're specifically warned of counterfeits in the Scriptures.
Absolutely.
We're going to try to squeeze in a few more calls here. We have Mike from Provo.
Hi. I had another comment, but to comment on what the previous caller said, I'm LDS, of course. We never said we had a monopoly on loving the Lord. We recognize that all religions are good. They may not have the truth, as we preach it, but we don't claim that other people are bad or that other people don't love God because they're not LDS. That's ridiculous.
You do claim, though, that all our professors are corrupt and all our creeds are an abomination, though, correct?
Well, Joseph Smith said that, right, but
and your scriptures say that Presbyterianism is not true.
Like her do, we don't investigate every little nook and cranny of every other religion and criticize everything that ever happened within that church.
But you don't necessarily go into great detail, but you do dismiss them entirely. And
no, we don't.
You don't dismiss them entirely?
We understand that all religions, all churches have good people doing the best that they can with the knowledge.
But you don't believe they have the fullness of the gospel?
No, we don't.
And you don't believe they're true church?
That doesn't mean we hate them or that we think they're any less important to God. God loves all people regardless of what church they go to.
But you don't believe they're true churches?
No, because of the reasons that you know.
And we're not demonizing LDS here.
Well,
we're saying that this.
You talked about your frustration. The frustration that I have with people like Sandra Tanner is they mix truth with lies. And
what lies has she told this evening?
Well, first of all, her testimony of the three witnesses. She said it was some kind of a some kind of a, she called it a vision, and then she talked about some kind of a mind.
She's quoting from their own writings.
Well, I'll quote right now. It says, "We testify that we have seen the engravings which are on the plate."
I understand that. She's quoting from the...
Let's say we had a vision. It says, "We have engraving."
Mike, was she not quoting from things that they themselves said at other times?
I don't know where she got her information.
Well, why don't you...
I've seen other...
Mike, Mike, why don't you write her at Sandra at utlm.org?
She doesn't respond. You're the only one on this channel that responds. She doesn't respond.
I respond to my emails.
You have not responded to mine, ever.
I don't know what emails you're referring to.
And one other question. Joseph Smith and his
Mike,
Moroni told him that his name would be...
we have other people in line.
People in all of the world. Explain how he knew that. How he knew his name would be known in all of the world.
An ego. Mike, thank you for calling. If you have a question, I have some knowledge of some of these things. I've actually read some of these materials. I don't retain nearly as much as I wish I did. If you have a question, everything that I've heard this evening, I've seen the documentation in this area. I suggest you write to Sandra, and she can provide you the address to All Believers in Christ, 1887, by David Whitmer.
And the Martin Harris statements. We have, I think, at least one of them up on our website, but the Whitmer book is completely on our website. These things are readily available sources that Mormon historians are familiar with these different statements by the witnesses. It's not like I'm pulling something out of a hat. I think Richard Bushman in his Rough Stone Rolling makes reference to these different statements.
I think it's... I have to compliment you. I've done it personally, but I want to compliment you on the air. I have watched, there are a lot of people who have made sometimes outrageous accusations that have mixed in error, mixed in what they would like to be true with what is true. But, I've yet to find anything substantive wrong with anything you've ever done. I mean,
right. I don't claim to be perfect, but these are areas that I know the references on, and I'm glad to give someone the references. If they write me, I can tell you where they're at, and they can all be looked up at the University of Utah Library or at the church library, BYU Library. These are not hidden sources. It's just that most people aren't familiar with them.
We're going to try to squeeze in one more call here. We have Michael with us from Ogden.
Hi, how you doing?
Doing well.
Well, I'd like to first I'll say that Sandra, you look very radiant tonight.
It's easily confused with contentiousness.
LDS from this one I mentioned earlier. Maybe they're radiant. I'm just saying maybe they're radiant because we're the leading state per capita for antidepressants. Maybe they're radiant because they're taking Prozac. Anyway, I have a question for you, Sandra. Because I'm not from the state, and I moved here, and I'm going to school here. Not familiar with Mormons. Where we're from, we just call them a cult back east. I mean, everyone considers that. But I'd like to know, do you remember, both of you guys, do you remember in the New Testament where it says, in the latter days, there will be an angel, Satan will appear as an angel of light and deceive and mislead many, and so on and so forth. And that is what I kind of think Joseph was receiving on his visions, if he had any. But what I'd like to know very specifically is that I'd like to know what do you think Joseph Smith was doing? Was he a complete fraud, or was he receiving visions? In your opinion, what was his objective for all this? And I'll just hang up and listen. And again,
thank you, Mike.
You look more radiant.
Okay.
Thank you, Michael.
I think Joseph knows that he is perpetrating a fraud when he brings out the Book of Mormon. There are those that want to be gentler and say, well, he was just deceived and maybe he really thought he got revelations or something. But when he goes to the hill and claims that he is then getting plates out of that hill that he specifically is going to carry home and hide under the hearth in the fireplace, sometimes hiding it in a wood in the log or something, then there is a specific claim of a specific artifact, and so you can't say he just had a vision and thought it was all true. I believe he has to know that when he puts out the Book of Mormon, it is not a historical document, it is not a translation from plates. He may have rationalized that he thought this was doing some sort of good to talk about Jesus in the book, but he has to know there were no plates.
Well, Sandra, always a pleasure having you on. We've got about a minute and a half, and so we have to be careful letting folks try to squeeze in calls because their questions go long sometimes.
Right.
I want to get a little housekeeping out of the way. If you would like to visit with us here on the set, here at TV 20, we have an open house this Friday from 7 to 9. We're going to have hot chocolate, cold chocolate, and I think everything in between. We're going to have free gifts. It's not only going to be myself, but all the hosts are going to be here from the various locally produced shows. And so we hope you can come. It's free. In fact, we will be giving you materials. So hope you can join us this Friday from 7 to 9. The focus of our show is not a restoration, as we've been talking about, but rather a reformation. Not something where some prophet claims that he's been given some unique vision, but what we long to see is what we see over and over in the scriptures and in the history of the church, a reformation, going back to God's word and adjusting all things according to what he says. Our congregation meets at 8630 West, 2700 South, Sunday mornings at 11 a.m. and 5:30 p.m. We have a mission work in Logan. I invite you to worship with us soon. If you have any questions about our program or about our ministries, we invite you to give us a call. Our phone number is 969-7948. Until next time, we wish you the Lord's blessings and hope you can join us for future episodes. Past episodes are available on the website. Good night.